Greg, are you moving it back?
Yeah. It's not particularly easy to start from the scratch, is it?
No.
All right, we'll get there. We got 6 minutes to get there. Now you're going to go online, correct? I mean, you're going to show your face. Okay. Oh boy. What's that noise?
If you want to,
So you're going to turn it over to me right here.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I want to go to chat now. So you're going to mention the questions? Why do you want me to turn off the camera?
Good afternoon and welcome to our Rural Development 101 webinar today. We really appreciate you all joining us for a Lunch and Learn series. We're kicking off with our Rural Development webinar today and really want to just send our appreciation to you for attending. A little brief overview on Lumina compliance. Our team focuses on asset management, ADA Section 504, fair housing compliance, capital needs assessments, evaluation and transition plans, and file audits and reviews. We really want to be a good boutique company that can partner along with our clients or partners to be able to meet your needs and keep you in compliance. We're a young company that was founded by Greg Proctor here, but he's been in the business for over 35 years, myself for around 20 years. And the team here at Lumina Compliance, we've performed over 15,000 physical inspections for management companies, owners, and investors across the country. So Greg, he's had over 35 years of experience in the affordable housing industry, as well as HUD properties, tax credit, rural development. He's worked with owners, managers, housing authorities, housing finance agencies, banks, financial institutions, really to assist them in keeping their portfolios in compliance with federal regulations and mandates surrounding the low-income housing tax credit, Section 8, tax-exempt bonds, and rural development. He is going to do a great job today walking us through this conversation. I think it's something that he is absolutely passionate about. Actually, I've developed a passion for it through Greg, and love hearing just Greg talk and learn and educate. Even though we've been together for a long time, I still learn something. So I hope you all take away a lot here today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Greg and let him dive into the session. Two things I do want to tell you. There's a Q&A. Please submit any questions that you have. Also in the chat along the side there, you'll see, please put in any areas that you would like us to focus on. If Greg has hit something that is happening at one of your properties or a situation, we'll be more than happy to dive into that. And then afterwards, we'll just go through. Of course, we promised a $250 Amazon gift card. All the attendees, I put your name in my little lucky hat here, so I'll be drawing out, making that fair. And we'll go through those question and answers at the end. So with that, Greg, please go ahead and
well, thanks, Andy. I was thinking about this morning, the fact that I've probably been in the affordable housing longer than you've been alive. So at some point, I feel like maybe I should stop talking about how many years I've been in the business. One thing I did also want to mention out, if you do want to chat and ask questions, I'd recommend you just do them through the admin only, and that way Andy or I both can put those questions out there without you feeling like you're going to ask a stupid question. There are no stupid questions. In my mind, there are only stupid answers. So hopefully I won't have any of those. So let's talk a little bit about accessibility and rural development. Rural development, interesting enough, implemented accessibility long before HUD did. But the thing that I want to talk about today primarily is the fact that rural development requires an accessibility and transition plan, or they call it a self-evaluation and transition plan every 3 years. And if you don't have one or don't have a current one, they want you to do that immediately. So that's a very important thing to understand. Back when I first started doing this in 1988, I figured this would be a 1 year kind of thing to get everybody to do a transition plan on their property and figure out what they need to make it accessible. Little did I know that 30-something years later, we still would be dealing with this, and we are going to continue to deal with this. So let's talk a little bit about that. One thing I do want to mention to you is we do have we'll have a file in the file cabinet that will be this unnumbered letter. And the unnumbered letter basically talks about how rural development is requiring those transition plans to be done every 3 years. Luckily enough, I mean, 3 years may seem to be a lot, but at one point in the last probably 10 years, RD had a thought process of having them done every year. So at least you do not have to do them every year. So a couple things that I want to give you a backstory on. Your properties, whether they're a rural development or whether they're tax credit or HUD or even conventional, have laws that affect those properties. And so we're going to talk about each of those primary 3 laws that affect your property and kind of tell you why and how that applies to your property. So what you have is you have the Fair Housing Amendments Act, and that is kind of the update to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, Civil Rights Act, but adding familial status and disability. So any property built after or CO'd after March 13th, 1991 is going to fall under the Fair Housing Amendments Act. Now, most rural development properties were built long before that, but if you do have some properties that were built after 1991, then you're not only going to have to comply with Section 504, you're also going to have to comply with the Fair Housing Act as well. And there are different nuances to that. If you have a parking area, if you have a community area that you rent out to visitors or to the general public, and if you have a leasing office, then all those areas are going to have to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if you have a parking lot and a community room or a leasing office, you're going to have to comply to that, regardless of whether you have to comply with the Section 504 or Fair Housing Act. So this webinar is really about what we need to be understanding from a fair housing standpoint for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. RD implemented this regulation in 1982. HUD didn't get around to implement it until 1988. So RD was quite a few years quicker in getting this implemented. But what the requirement is from a Section 504 is that properties built after that time must have 5% of the units be completely accessible. And so we're going to talk about that today. Not only do you have to have accessible routes and parking and everything else, you also have to have fully accessible units in 5% of your property. So a couple things to understand about that is that townhomes that have downstairs and upstairs with living quarters upstairs are not covered by this regulation. So if you have a townhome only property, which there are some built in the 70s and 80s, then your units don't have to be in compliance, but your office, if you have one there, is a public accommodation and falls under ADA. In Section 504 requirements, all the doors through the property, through the unit, have to be on an accessible route. And the doorknobs in those units and on the doors into the bathroom, the kitchen, whatever, have to be lever type doorknobs. So when you're lever type doorknob, that is a situation where somebody that is frail, elderly, or having some sort of accessibility issue is going to need to be able to turn that knob without having to grip and grasp at that. I mean, if you think about somebody with arthritis trying to turn the doorknob, it makes it very difficult. So that is a requirement as part of the accessibility issues in your properties. Carpeting should also be low pile. So if you've got some carpeting in your units, and we see this all the time, that has, that you've put in a nice brand new carpet, but there's a thick padding and it's very thick. it's very difficult for a wheelchair or somebody that's mobility impaired to actually navigate across that carpet. So that's an important requirement. As far as the bathrooms are concerned, toilets and showers, tubs all need to have compliant grab bars. Now, when you're talking about the Fair Housing Amendments Act, those properties built after 1991, all they have to do is have blocking so that you can install grab bars later. However, to be considered to be an accessible unit, of which you have to have 5% of your property, you must have bathrooms and showers with properly installed grab bars. On top of this, another thing that we see quite often is the fact that you've got pipes under the kitchen, pipes under the bathroom sinks that are not protected or not covered. You need to have those covered simply because if somebody is mobility impaired and is going through and going up to use the sink in the bathroom or the kitchen, they may injure themselves either on hot water pipes or sharp edges. So you always want to see wrapped or protected piping under your sinks. On top of that, you also have to have a handheld at least 6 foot long handheld sprayer. You also have to have a tub seat and lever type faucets again. One of the misconceptions about tubs and showers is you have to have a roll-in shower as part of Section 504, and that is not the case unless somebody expressly in a regulatory agreement requests that you have roll-in showers. But you can have a tub, but you're going to need to make sure that in either case that they have shower seats so somebody can move from their wheelchair into the tub and sit in the tub on that seat. So those are a lot of the big things that are important. A couple other things that are required of Section 504 is there must be a usable kitchen and there must be clear space so that you can access the range, the refrigerator, the sink. So it's very nuanced, and a lot of you guys probably have properties that you think, oh, well, they need to have the cabinets removed under the kitchen sink. That is not quite the case. In some cases, you could have the cabinets remain, as in this one, as long as there is a clear opening in front of it and the counter is a certain height. Another thing that's kind of a misconception is that you must have front controlled ranges. Now, front control ranges are very helpful for somebody that is mobility impaired and especially is in a wheelchair. The problem with that is that if you've got kids in the unit, then they're able to actually control those controls and potentially turn on the stove, and it could be a fire hazard or they could hurt themselves. So while you will see a lot of cases where there are front controlled ranges, that is something that is not required but recommended. And you want to make sure you look at it from whether you have kids in the unit. There's another example of that. And then another thing we see quite often is in your closets, you need to be able to access those either from a forward reach range or a side reach range. And if you're having to go in, if it's not a walk-in closet and you're going, or a roll-in closet, and you're going to access that closet from a forward reach range, then that closet rod needs to be less than 48 inches or less so that somebody can actually use that from a sitting position. A couple of things to be aware of at your properties is that there are going to be units at your property that were built in the 70s and they were built in the 80s and don't fall under Section 504 per se, because Section 504 applies to units built after 1982. But on all cases, you need to understand that they still have the ability to ask for a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification. And so a resident can ask for a reasonable modification, and it has to be reasonable, and the owner is the one that decides whether it's reasonable or not. There are many properties, though, that are just not, it's not reasonable to make them accessible. In this picture you see in front of you, that is of a property built in 1965. That door into the bathroom is like 22 inches wide. You can see that there's no way to make that any wider. The inside of that building is cinder block, and the hallways are not but 27 inches wide. So in that case, you're not going to be able to make that unit completely accessible, nor would you be required to. But if somebody asks you for a modification, you would say that's not reasonable, and you could provide them with other properties down the street that might be able to accommodate their accessible needs. Now, one of the things that I think is really important to understand about this is when somebody is going out there to look at your property from an accessibility standpoint, and a couple things to be aware of is not only is it required by rural development, but it's law that is not exclusive to rural development. So anybody could come to your property and sue you for being out of compliance simply for some of these things that you see at your property. So one of the biggest things we see at just about every single property or many properties is your accessible units or accessible parking spaces are not in compliance. And it can be very nuanced. In this case, you've got to have van accessible parking. This is a brand new property or one that's built in the last few years. And it does not have an 8-foot wide access aisle or 11-foot wide accessible parking space. And even more importantly, there's no signage for van accessible parking. We see very often where there is no van accessible parking signage. Thermostats are another thing that we see quite often. And the reason why those typically tend to be out of compliance is that they are installed pretty much after the fact, and they're installed by a heating HVAC contractor who may not have the understanding of accessibility requirements, and they put those thermostats where they are most efficient to control the HVAC. But in cases like this, in accessible units, you must have that thermostat within a proper reach range. And a proper reach range in this example is 48 inches. And so you cannot have that greater than 48 inches high. And this one's a perfect example of that. We also see quite often a laundry that does not have a front-loading washing machine. Obviously, somebody that is in a seated position cannot access the bottom or basket of a top-loading washing machine, and so they're not accessible. Really easy thing to fix. You call your laundry provider, and they are really obligated to provide you one. Another thing we see quite often is mailboxes that appear to be accessible. You've got outgoing mailboxes that are below the 54 inches. But if somebody is in an accessible unit or has mobility impairments that you're aware of, and their boxes are above that 54 inches, you're out of compliance there. See that very, very often. And then probably the biggest thing we see inside a unit is where a maintenance person has gone in and removed a lever type handle because the resident broke the handle, and they replaced it with a doorknob. So it's very often you'll see that is one of the things that makes your unit out of compliance. From a standpoint of just about every single property, you're going to have things that are out of compliance, and that's one of the things that evaluation plans show you is what's out of compliance. And what you're going to find is even if you identify those things and correct them in the next year or two, you could have a situation where a lever type handle is replaced with a doorknob. Now, the good news in all of this is most of the items that are out of compliance at your property are fairly inexpensive to fix or replace. Most of the things like striping on the parking lot, changing out lever type handles, changing the height of the thermostats are very inexpensive. It's where you have issues with your accessible parking, or your toilet seats or toilet themselves are not 18 inches from the side wall, or if you have concrete or asphalt that you have to pour, that's where it gets to be expensive. But for the most part, when you have an accessibility plan done, you're not going to have a lot of things that are going to cost the property a whole lot of money. So you'll be able to knock those out pretty quickly. So this is kind of where I'm going to wrap this up a little bit, and feel free to be asking questions. But, there are properties out there where you can see that there is an obvious accessibility issue. And so we've got some that are obvious, and then we've got some that are not so obvious. In the case in front of you, obviously, it would be very difficult for somebody to go down to that leasing office with those stairs right there, and that's obvious. What's not so obvious is you've got a leasing office that has a ramp, because once you get over 5% change in elevation, you've got to make that sidewalk a ramp. And this ramp looks to be okay. It looks to be less than 8%, between 5 and 8.33%. But the problem is those railings are not 36 inches wide across, and so therefore this ramp to the office is not in compliance. Obviously, this is probably my favorite slide of all time. This is at a rural development property in the South, where I went to the property and found this. Obviously, this is not in compliance, and quite frankly, extremely dangerous and a liability. They have since obviously replaced that. But what is not so obvious is the same kind of situation. You've got a sidewalk that looks to be just a normal sidewalk, but the problem is it is a greater than 5% slope, and there are not railings on either side or both sides of the sidewalk. So in order to make it in compliance with ramps. So that's not so obvious. This is also not so obvious, and this is where a lot of people have gotten into trouble, is thresholds into your unit, into your accessible units, cannot be greater than 1/2 beveled inch change in elevation. And just by nature of somebody installing a door, they're going to want to keep water out primarily. And a lot of times that threshold ends up being more than 1/2 inch change of elevation. Obviously, and this is another example of a property that decided they were going to go in and fix some of the accessibility problems. They put a ramp into the accessibility or access aisle, which is not allowed. And then the most obvious part about that is the sidewalk goes up to a stoop that is at least 2 or 3 inches tall. And then there is a threshold into the units that's 2 or 3 inches tall as well. So that to me is pretty obvious. But this is not so obvious. It looks like a brand new accessible parking spaces. But the problem is everything is great except they do not have a van accessible signage. Now, this is also something that's, in my mind, very obvious. I hope everybody sees that. You see where the accessible bathroom signage with tactile signage in there is at 8 or 9 feet. I have no idea what somebody was thinking there, but you will see some things like that at your properties as well. But what you won't see is something that says, okay, well, that signage is right. We've got a lever type handle. But what is not obvious about this is that coat hook in the very back is not accessible to somebody in a forward reach range sitting down. So that must be at 48 inches. So those are the kind of things that we see at properties, and you know, just going out and doing inspection of your properties are going to see or not see. So the point of this session really is to kind of see where you might find some of those issues at your property. So that's really all of the kind of slides I wanted to go over at this point. One of the things that Andy mentioned earlier that I do want to continue to reinforce is that we are going to be doing this once a month, and we would love to hear input as to what you would like to see on these lunch and learns. The fact is, these accessibility laws are very detailed and have a lot of different nuances to them. And so we're happy to get into any kind of deep dive into any of this that you would like to see. So please make some recommendations if you like, and would love to present that in a future webinar. So with that, Andy, I'll let you take it over.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Appreciate all that information. Wanted to just hop into a couple of questions that folks have posted here. One is developers are using the Nest thermostats. I think there's probably a couple of other types of those digital thermostats. Are those truly accessible devices?
I would say there's two things that are concerning about those, and one is obviously if it's not below 48 inches or at 48 inches, I would say that it would not be accessible. That's the easy answer. As far as I know, where the question asker is going on this is that you're talking about a twisting of the dial to get to that. You also, in my mind, can also do a changing of that dial like this. So it would not require twisting. So I would look primarily at whether or not that thermostat is within the proper reach range. Also, most of those thermostats are controlled by your smartphone, and so you can make the changes to that. But I would always write up a Nest thermostat that is not below 48 inches, because I'm going to assume that the household does not have access to that app on their phone. Very good question, though.
Yeah. Another one was that I have a 21 unit property, so I only need one accessible unit. Is that correct?
21 units? No, that's not correct. So we'll see this a lot, especially given the fact that RD units are typically small. In an RD unit, you've got a situation where you've got 40 units or 21 units or 24 units. But if you multiply 21 times 5%, you're going to get a number a little bit over or less than 5%. So you're going to have two accessible units if you have anything between 21 and 40. So, 40 units are going to be two. The minute you go into 41 units or 42 units, and we see a lot of 42 unit properties, a lot of 24 unit properties, a lot of 44 unit properties. So make sure that your calculator is not rounding up, because most calculators might round up to 5%, but it is very, very common to see where there's only one accessible unit on a 21 unit property. Another good question.
Yeah. We've got just a couple more here. One is, I have a townhome. I've been told that it needs to be made accessible. Is that true?
Okay, there's another kind of nuance to that too. Obviously, townhomes, as I mentioned earlier, are not covered units, so you do not have to make townhomes accessible. Now, if somebody is asking for a modification that is reasonable, then you could make some of those items in that unit accessible. It would not be reasonable to put in a chair lift into that unit. It would not be reasonable to have an elevator put in, but it would be reasonable to help maybe with a bathroom fixture or grab bars or something like that.
Perfect. Can a transition plan be paid for out of your reserves?
Absolutely. That's an easy answer.
And then can I do these plans myself?
Well, I mean, yes, you can. Obviously, when the regulation came out in '88 and clarified that for HUD, they also clarified RD. It's called a self-evaluation and transition plan. So yes, I mean, the initial thought process is that everybody was going to go in and do this themselves and devise a transition plan and a completion date and a plan to correct all the issues. What we have found quickly in that is that while RD allows that, the problem with that is that most of the managers that do that self-evaluation or regionals don't have enough of an understanding of the regulations to go and do that properly. On top of that, it's a project expense. So in my mind, why would you want to have your regional or your manager doing that work as part of the management fee when you can have it be part of either the operating expense or reserves?
Awesome. And then our last question is from one of the attendees here. Do you also work with individuals, or does it have to be a corporation, a larger management company?
If you will reach out to me on that, I'm not sure what you're asking for on the individuals. We typically work with we work with management companies and owners primarily, but we certainly have the ability to do that for other entities as well.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate it. That does wrap us up. That does not mean that you can't follow up with us and post further questions. I also in the chat have entered in the website if you'd like to register for the upcoming webinar on our Tax Credits 101 that we'll be diving into. We would love your feedback. We would also love to talk to you here, both with the questions that have been answered, but also if there are any, or if you have a project for us to look at, be more than happy to. Our contact information is on the screen here. Of course, I know everybody's excited. We've got that $250 Amazon gift card to put it in our little blue hat, and truly have all our attendees that are there are in there. So this is going to be random. And we have Michelle Young as our winner there. So we'll reach that out to you and make sure you get that right after the call. Our next webinar, once again, is on September 15th. It's same time. I would love to have some lunch with you all here while we get some education. And with that, once again, please make sure that you're mindful of this. We know that it's kind of like a tetanus shot, these plans. You have to do them once every 3 years, and somebody asks you when the last time you did it, and you go, I don't know, I got the shot in the last 10 years. We will help you maintain those plans, keep that up, and love to have the opportunity to partner along with you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will look forward to seeing you on September 15th for our Tax Credits 101.